It's another edition of the Golazo podcast, so we take another dive into the world of Argentine football to discuss the latest news from Buenos Aires. Whether you're listening on YouTube, iTunes or SoundCloud, be sure to like, follow, subscribe or whatever it is that you can show us that you're out there. Hello, it's the return of the Golazo podcast and we look back on a Copa America that began badly for Argentina, got a little worse, but ended with perhaps a hint of optimism, along with a good old hefty dose of CONMEBOL controversy. With that behind the Albiceleste, we look ahead to what the future holds for the team and coach Lionel Scaloni, taking the opportunity to look at the younger options he may have available by casting our minds back to the U20 World Cup. And if the prospect of talking about Argentina's men's team is all a little bit too gloomy, then we look back on a positive World Cup campaign for Argentina's women. All that and whatever else we happen to ramble on about coming up on the Golazo podcast. Joining me, as always, this evening is Tom Robinson. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good, Peter. Good to be back after a little bit of a hiatus. But it's going to be interesting to talk about a bit of a mixed bag of a competition, both for Argentina and the organisers. But I think it's going to be interesting to discuss that because, well, on one hand, it's pretty shambolic, and on the other hand, you can draw some positives out of it. So it's good. It's a good one to debate, I think.
Absolutely, and I thank you for being very kind there with your brief hiatus. It's been a very long hiatus for the podcast, and that's on me. But we are joined this evening by debutant for the Golazo podcast, Tim Stillman. Thanks very much for joining us, Tim.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Right, so we'll jump straight in then. Tom, Argentina's Copa America, how did you assess the campaign?
It's a difficult one, really, isn't it? Because it all kind of depends on the context that or the criteria that you're judging on it. In terms of their historic place at the football table, that realistically, there's nothing to get too excited about, and particularly the way it started with that really humbling defeat to Colombia, a pretty lucky result against Paraguay, and then just scraping through against Qatar. It almost mirrored the World Cup in many ways in terms of how they were just sort of staring down the barrel of a gun, but managed to pull it out of the bag. But I suppose the other way of looking at it is looking at it in its shambolic context of managerial changes and an aging generation that's belatedly tried to be rejuvenated. It's kind of maybe not too bad a tournament. I think there's a general feeling of maybe some light at the end of the tunnel, but maybe that says more about how far Argentina have fallen that this can be deemed something of a, well, not a disaster. Well, what would you say, Peter?
No, I agree. I mean, I think if you look at it in terms of historically, then yes, it's just another year added on to the drought, which obviously a nation like Argentina shouldn't be going from 1993 until now without a major trophy. But I think anyone who's watched Argentina over the last couple of years wouldn't have really gone to Brazil talking about them going there to win it. So with that in mind, I think you really looked at it as, well, semi-finals was probably about right, or if anything, maybe even overachieving. What was your view of Argentina, Tim, or especially maybe from a Brazilian standpoint of view?
Yeah, it's weird because I've constantly kind of, going on like radio shows and podcasts in Europe and stuff, and people ask me about Argentina, and during the Copa America I realised I got so fed up of saying that Argentina are in disarray that I was kind of like, to be honest, they've been like this for so long that it just doesn't seem like disarray anymore. It's just like disarray is just what Argentina is now. This is like their normal state somehow. And so probably like you guys, I had very little expectation of them in this tournament other than maybe being a bit of an entertaining car crash. And it's certainly like in the Colombia game. I mean, I thought they were absolutely dreadful in that game, quite frankly. And Colombia, from watching Colombia play Brazil over the last few years. Colombia did a similar thing to what they do against Brazil, where they get this mad inferiority complex and they just start kicking everyone. And I look at them and I think, you probably don't have to do that against either Argentina or Brazil. You can probably play them toe to toe at football. And I think Colombia slowly realised that during that game and kind of thought, oh yeah, actually, if we just like play football, we're a better team than these guys. That they did. I think you're right to kind of like sound it off with a slight note of optimism, because I do think Argentina kind of grew into it a little bit. And I know the Copa America is a really compact tournament, so it's hard to grow into, but I thought they were unlucky against Brazil, much in the way that I thought Brazil were unlucky against Belgium in the World Cup quarter-final a year earlier. I think if you play that game another 3 or 4 times, you probably get a couple of Argentina victories. If a couple of those assaults in the penalty area had been seen by either the referee or the VAR, we'd probably be talking about a much different game. And they won the third. I know it's the third place playoff, but I thought they won that pretty convincingly and quite deservedly. I think they found something at the end of the tournament with this front three of Messi, Martinez and Aguero, and I think that might be, I don't really know how much longer Messi's going to put up with playing for Argentina, and I think that's the big question. But that was the first time since I can remember, really, in at least 3 or 4 years, where I thought Argentina had a front three, and I thought, that actually works as a bit of a unit. It's not just, this complete breakdown. So I think you're right to suggest there's a note of optimism, but it's difficult to know how Argentina can build on that now with the kind of scenario around Messi. Will he retire again? I don't think the coach is very good, Scaloni, to be quite honest. So it's kind of, again, it feels like disarray, but like disarray has become equilibrium somehow for Argentina.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think you're right that there was the optimism does perhaps come from the fact that after such an awful start, the semi-final performance against Brazil, as you said, was a bit unlucky, but was a fairly decent-ish performance, certainly an improvement. It was a step in the right direction. And then they kind of followed that up again with a decent enough performance against Chile in the third place playoff. And I think, not sure how much it was a masterstroke from Scaloni or whether he stumbled across it, but certainly Lautaro Martinez did provide one of the pluses for Argentina going forward, as did, I think, Aguero. With the two of them together, I think Aguero, as one of the older generation, had those question marks hanging around over him. A lot of people suggesting Aguero could possibly just go the way of Higuain, Mascherano, Biglia, Di Maria, and just get rid of all of that generation. Whereas I think Aguero showed that he does still have life in him and that he does still provide Argentina with what he can at club level, which is one of the best strikers in Europe.
Absolutely. And you know what? It was about time. I tend to agree that maybe Scaloni just stumbled across it, but I mean, it's about time Argentina just stumbled across something, because they really have tried everything like 2 or 3 times. Like players like Higuain, Di Maria, kind of brought back in at the beginning of the tournament. It's like, oh no, he's still playing rubbish for us. Let's, just this kind of recycling of players, and then every now and then throwing in a random option like Lucas Prato that works for a couple of games until you realise that he's not really that good. And maybe that's the case with Martinez as well. Maybe it's like a little bit of a dead cat bounce. But I mean, given how many things Argentina have tried over the last few years, it was about time they stumbled across something.
I think that's the key sort of feature of Scaloni's reign so far, is he's been trying so many new faces. And at first, especially when we started out on this podcast, both myself and Peter were pretty optimistic about some of the new faces he was bringing in. But I feel like in that interim period, he never really settled on anyone in those trials and tests in those various friendlies, and the kind of that positivity about trying some new people and some younger players quickly turned into, oh wait a minute, he doesn't really look like he knows who his best 11 is, or who even is best 23 or anything like that. It just changed so much that but at the start of the tournament, as he said, there was still that massive feeling of flux. And as you said, Lautaro's come in. I think he complements Aguero and Messi in terms of he can do the energetic, bustling running. He's the top scorer in Scaloni's reign. And obviously Aguero and Messi have got that long friendship both on and off the field. And realistically, even though they've both been around the setup for a long time, there's been a lot of occasions, particularly in the last World Cup qualifying campaign, where it was very rare that they actually managed to have that much game time together, whether that be through Messi's retirement or suspensions and Aguero's injuries or just being out of favour. So the fact that those two could click, like we saw for that first goal against Chile, which was absolutely a beautiful pick from Messi, I think that showed that those two are working well. Messi's dropping a bit deeper as his legs can't carry them as sprightly as they used to do, and Martinez, as he's shown for Racing and in spurts for Inter, he's got something about him. I really like it. He looks like he's there for the big game moments, and certainly that first 30 minutes against Chile was really good. The second half against Venezuela, again, as you've both said, the game against Brazil was impressive, and a couple of chances against the woodwork, as well as those sort of debatable VAR calls. But I do think that, Peter, you'll be able to say better than me being out there in Argentina, but I think it would be a bit foolish if we focus too much on the controversies and the bad luck, in inverted commas, that's gone against Argentina there, because I think that sort of papers over the cracks of some pretty heavy work that needs to be done on this squad.
Oh, absolutely, and I think it would be very beneficial for Argentina perhaps to be able to focus on that, and I think to some extent they have. I mean, in part because obviously what Messi said made it a much bigger story than it would have been. Would have been a big story anyway, but I think with Messi not going up for his medal and mentioning controversy, and then before the final hinting that there's no chance Peru stand a chance against Brazil, it made it a much bigger thing, and I think it has taken the attention off those other things that you mentioned where Argentina do need to work on. Before we get on to onto that sort of corruption thing, where else would you say the plus points for Argentina's point of view were? Because we obviously talked for years about Argentina's strength in attack, and we say now that those three, of Lautaro, Aguero and Messi, eventually seem to click, but it's often been problems in midfield, balancing that midfield. And towards the end of the tournament, I thought Leandro Paredes gave a very bright example of perhaps where that midfield's heading.
Yeah, he's been someone who I've been waiting to kind of step up and grab his chance in the centre of midfield. I think a lot of people, especially those in Argentina who kind of remember him more as a 10 breaking through at Boca, are maybe a bit surprised that he's in this deeper lying position. But to be honest, he's been playing for that for quite some time in Europe now, and maybe he's not that traditional, Claudicio Jefe with giving the Mascherano huevos at the base of midfield, but he's he can create from deep. He's an intelligent user of the ball. He protects it very well, and particularly I think from that Venezuela game onwards, he really sort of realised that shirt is now his, and he can be an absolute pillar in that team, along with Lo Celso, who I think had a quiet, not a quiet tournament, but it maybe wasn't quite the shining light as he has been in maybe some of the friendlies. But those two, as we've kind of said for a while, they're the midfielders who look like they've got the most potential to be cornerstones of this national team going forward. And I think Rodrigo de Paul also deserves a good mention. He's versatile, and he seemed again to balance out that the side quite nicely, especially with the issues at fullback and defence, as I'm sure we'll come on to.
Yeah, I thought it started to look a bit more balanced. I mean, Lo Celso kind of started off in the tournament, and I was quite excited about him. But I don't think, I wouldn't say he wasn't up to it, but he didn't really perform in some of those early games, and that's the thing I can't shake with Argentina, though. As much as I think the midfield is beginning to look balanced, and that front three, they might have stumbled across something. I keep thinking, but Argentina have had a lot of players over the last couple of years who have a couple of good games, and you think, here we go, that's it now. And then it just kind of drops off, whether it be because the coach changes or because the coach doesn't know what else is happening around the team. And it's a bit like whack-a-mole, like they feel like they solve one problem and then another one pops up, and then it just. So I'd probably sound a note of caution there, particularly because that Argentina defence is just not impressive to me at all. And I think that's where quite a lot of the problems are, trying to plug those gaps back there. And yeah, I think that three, kind of with Acuna, Paredes and a De Paul as well, began to look quite good. But I'd be interested to see if they still look good in like November or next year, when qualifying really starts.
Yeah, and I think you're right to point out there's particularly maybe someone like Acuna or De Paul, whether they have that quality for a long stint in the national team at that level. But certainly Rodrigo De Paul, I thought, did his chances no harm, considering he's one of those players that was perhaps a slight surprise going into the tournament, that he still got a squad place, but ended up being quite a vital part of that 11. And I think, again, perhaps it was Scaloni stumbling across that midfield, but I felt a bit sympathy for Lo Celso earlier in the tournament, because I felt as though Scaloni's obviously a big fan of Lo Celso, but kind of just asks him to do a lot of different things and shoved him out on the right in one game and then brought him back centrally, and then it was sort of drifting onto the left, and he didn't quite seem to know where to get the best out of him. So that's going to be a work in progress going forward. And as you said, as ever, I think with Paredes, as good as he was, I do sometimes wonder, with him not being the most natural ball winner, when he's the only person as a sort of solo number 5, do Argentina risk getting overrun a little bit in midfield? So perhaps we will see in these friendlies coming up a change before the obviously critical start of the World Cup qualifiers begin. But as ever, we've mentioned, I think, on every single podcast, and we've already hinted at today, that defence remains the real concern, and certainly the Copa America did very little to ease those fears. Tom, I mean, where do Argentina go with the back four?
Oh, that's $1 million question, really, isn't it? I mean, whereas with the midfield, you could see, I don't know, like a destroyer like Ascasibar or Santiago Cáceres coming in, or maybe someone with a bit more legs like Zaracha or Palacios or Lanzini or Pity Martinez for a bit more width. But for defence, it's slim pickings, really, isn't it? I think Tagliafico's got the left back spot nailed down. I mean, again, an average tournament at best for him, but there's not really anyone challenging him, and he's not done anything to really show himself up. Renzo Saravia had a bit of a nightmare just when we thought, could he be maybe not the answer, but an answer at right back? I mean, Foyth was interesting at right back. He had some good moments, he had some bad moments. He kept Everton pretty quiet in the Brazil game for spells, but yeah, I mean, fullback, especially right back, is a big issue. Otamendi needs to go. Petzela, again, didn't do anything to really impress me, but I feel like maybe alongside a more mobile centre back than Otamendi, then he could start forming something decent there. It's going to be interesting. I think that is the key area of the squad that really needs major surgery. And it's weird because I feel like there maybe are a few guys out there who could do a job, but they all are lacking in experience. I mean, Lisandro Martinez, who's just gone to Ajax, is a good versatile option who's a very good ball playing centre back. Not the tallest, but could be an option. I've been a long-term fan of Emmanuel Mamana, but again, I just don't really know what's going on with him. I mean, maybe he's going to be the next Ezekiel Garay that we're always just scratching our heads about. Why is he not in the national team? And then there's people like Christian Romero just gone, which is signed by Juve. Kahneman's getting some interest from abroad, and then there's the younger players like Leo Belerde, Noen Perez. There's lots of potential, but no one who you kind of think is going to come straight in and do a job. Again, it feels like they might need to stumble across something, and goalkeeper as well there's a lot of 6 out of 10s out there. No one who's really making a real claim for it. I think Armani, obviously got that penalty save against Paraguay, which was quite big in the grand context of the tournament, but he's not really an elite level goalkeeper as much as he is a brilliant shot stopper in Argentina. So maybe you'd be looking at giving someone like Musso or Esteban Andra a chance. There's just a lot of question marks. A lot of experimentation is still needed there at a time when we're running out of fixtures and days where you can experiment. So yeah, it's kind of peeking from behind the sofa at the the possibilities at the moment.
I mean, there's obviously there's a real lack of individual quality, which is obviously a big issue. I mean, Otamendi's 31, 32, and he's not even that good. When you've got a defender who's 31, that's kind of prime centre half age. You'd really want a bit of a leader, and that's definitely not what Otamendi is. And Funes Mori, that's not the answer.
Funes Mori is never the answer.
I was going to say, I don't know what the question is if he's the answer. The bet, and I don't have a suggestion, but I just think the best thing that Argentina can almost hope for here, and again, I'm not sure they've got the coach to do this, is to maybe stumble across something. But you look at Chile's back four for the last kind of 6-7 years. It hasn't had great individuals in it. Bosujor, Gary Medel, and Gonzalo Gerard and players like that, but they kind of work as a unit. They found a way to make those players work in an overall style, and it's all a bit chicken and egg. But you feel like Argentina kind of need to get a bit of an identity and overall playing style, and then perhaps you can get a good defensive unit out of that. But I suppose it's which comes first. Do you get the defensive unit first, which then necessitates the style of play that Argentina have really been missing, other than give it to Messi for the last few years? Or do you get the style and then the back four settle into that? I think it's probably got to be the latter. You've got to establish the style first, because there aren't any defenders good enough to truly build around. I think they've got to try and do something and give those defenders a really clear job. And that's difficult as well. When you've got someone like Jan Foyth at right back, and he's not even really a right back. He's a slightly shaky central defender at the moment, and he can't get up and down. Maybe in the 1990s you could hide a developing centre half at fullback, but I don't think you can really do that in the modern game. Not if you want to be an enterprising, successful team. So. I think you're right at left back. Tagliafico is probably decent enough. If they could get a decent enough right back, then they could probably start to get something there. But yeah, having a slightly young, shaky centre half there is not really the answer. And to be fair, I do have some sympathy for Scaloni here, because I'm not really sure what the answer is.
No, you're right. I mean, there isn't an obvious answer that you can sort of say, Scaloni's really missing the point here. But you're also right to say that I think it's going to depend upon quite an astute coach to find the solution. Whether that is Scaloni, it really remains to be seen. I think, as you point out, that really Argentina's dearth of options at right back is highlighted by the fact that at the latter stages of a major tournament, Foyth is seen as the answer, and that's not a knock on him, but it's a very young centre-back who is still finding his way, trying to get experience at club level. So there's a problem there, and I think although Argentina again will hide behind in the Brazil game, the penalty decision not going for them when Dani Alves collided with Aguero, that break for Brazil's second really highlighted in really scary fashion just how slow and cumbersome Argentina are at centre-back, with Otamendi and Pesela both just absolutely burned in that goal. So there are a huge amount of questions that Scaloni needs to answer. And, well, if you were being kind, I think you'd say maybe he is the man to do it, but there hasn't been much evidence of that. And I think moving forward, as you mentioned, Tom, earlier, that there aren't that many opportunities to test things out before we get into the real difficult world of CONMEBOL South American World Cup qualifying. Argentina have said Scaloni's going to stay until the end of the year. So in a sense, that makes it even more difficult, because you sort of look at it, well, Scaloni's going to be taking charge of these 6 friendlies. At the end of the year, if the AFA then say, actually, maybe he's not the man, whoever comes in then comes to go straight into the qualifiers without having that period of time to experiment and have a look at what he's got.
Yeah, for me, this is the kind of the biggest worry and sort of overall negative that I think I've taken from the tournament, is the fact that AFA, because they're taking the cheap option, they've extended Scaloni's contract, and as you said, if he does get the chop, even though he seems like Chiqui Tapia likes him and wants him continued all the way through to the qualifiers, if he does have a mare early on in the first few qualifiers and gets the chop, and someone else is brought in, be that Gallardo, Ainse, or maybe someone like Gareca, if they're very lucky, that just gives them even less time to work. I think you said on Twitter as well that you can just see the scenario now of it going all terribly wrong, and then I don't know, 8 months before a World Cup or 12 months before a World Cup, just parachuting someone in and then being exactly in the same situation they were with San Pauli. So I think it's they've used close to 100 different players, and maybe if you're a bit of a glutton for punishment, maybe this continuity, no matter how underwhelming it is maybe what they need. I mean, Scaloni's shown that as much as he's, the players praise him for his communication in a way that San Pauli failed to get his ideas across, or admittedly with some pretty poor raw material. But Scaloni seems to have the goodwill of the group. He seems to have the goodwill of the AFA. But I think his substitutions and his in-game management, we saw that particularly against Brazil and in the opening games as well. He made some pretty poor decisions that kind of turned the tide against Argentina, and just bringing on headless chicken Di Maria as a pacey option off the bench. It's just things like that are the kind of more depressing side of things. I would much rather a manager with more experience, who's proven themselves. Certainly Gallardo's got a great cup pedigree, and he's done wonders in sort of very different, not just one team at River, but he's created a lot of different teams in his reign at River. Ainse is a really progressive manager who works well with young players, and I mean even the likes of Caldet and Almeida I think would probably be upgrades on Scaloni. So that is the big worry. Do you just want to have a bit of stability and keep Scaloni and just think, okay, we're probably not going to be challenging for the World Cup in Qatar, let's just use this guy as a stopgap for a few years just to get some kind of experience among the younger players, and then once we've got a bit of money in the bank and a more experienced playing squad, do we bring in someone who's genuinely got some ideas about how to mould this group of players into something effective and more progressive more progressive. So, yeah, it's tricky. I don't know what you guys think about Scaloni. I imagine it might be fairly similar.
Yeah, I mean, the question for AFA is, can they afford better at the moment? And the answer to that is probably no. And therefore, I think you're right. I think they kind of might as well stick, and unless they think they can get someone better. Like, I mean, if they could get Ricardo Gareca, although even with Gareca, I'm not sure he'd be able to. He's done a brilliant job with Peru, but obviously this is a completely different job with completely different players. I mean, I'm staggered, I'm stunned he didn't end up in the Argentina job after the World Cup, but I kind of wonder with him whether he is ready to move on from Peru now, just because he qualified for them for the World Cup. He got them to the Copa America final. It's not going to get better than that. His legacy is totally secure. And I wouldn't be surprised if he was looking at things and thinking, right, I've probably done pretty much all I can do. I can walk off into the sunset. But I mean, there's a part of me that thinks he'd be mad to take the Argentina job, quite frankly, even if AFA could afford him and could afford to pay yet another coach off. And so I guess what AFA have to do is take a bit of a long view. And you're right, and think, well, if we can't get anyone really, really good now, what's the point? Let's kind of go on for a couple of years, and then maybe, when the coffers are a little bit replenished, maybe, because, Argentina don't lack top class coaches. It's just AFA can't afford any of them. Do they take that long view of, well, maybe in 2, 3, 4 years, let's go into like dreamland. Maybe Simeone, will be done doing whatever he's doing, and will want to come into the job. Maybe Pochettino, whoever. I mean, I don't think those are likely, but whether they just start to really take that long view, and you're right, almost use Scaloni as a bit of a patsy at this point, and just say we can't get better. He's already here. He knows what he's got. He's already gone through the let's try 10 different starting lineups phase that inevitably the next coach would have to do. But a lot of it, I think, rests quite a bit on what Messi does next, whether he continues to play for Argentina. There's a big part of me that thinks maybe it would be best for everyone if he didn't, just for Argentina to have that absolutely clean break and that proper sense of like revolution. I know that's fairly dangerous talk, I guess, but I wouldn't blame him for kind of just going, I'm sick of this, and actually all of his comments about CONMEBOL really just gave me it's my last day at the job and I'm going to tell everyone what I think of them vibe. But because obviously that would make the job completely different. But in a sense, if he did stop, it would give, I think, a coach a little bit of leeway, maybe a little bit of tolerance, and a little bit of space to try and do something else.
I almost feel like that possibility of him giving the side a little bit of leeway has almost been and gone in terms of I think the World Cup would have been the perfect, and we all kind of thought that he was going to take an extended break away from the national team and maybe not come to this Copa America, but keep himself rested and come back renewed for the next Copa America, when perhaps with a slightly more experienced and settled squad, Argentina maybe would have an outside chance of doing something. But the fact I kind of see it, I mean, I definitely get where you're coming from with that reading of it, but part of me almost thinks that now he's back and he seems to be kind of, I don't know, part of the group, more vocal than we've ever seen him before, and there was a noted lack of dependency on Messi, apart from the Brazil game where he did kind of step up and show his class. I don't know, I kind of read, maybe misguidedly, the sort of his anger as kind of maybe more of a
renewed enthusiasm,
or something like that. I mean, I think Jorge Valdano said it best, is that we kind of saw two Messis at this tournament, neither of which we'd seen before. The kind of more earthly performances on the pitch, where he didn't have his best tournament by a long shot, and the more vocal presence off it, and he kind of described it as less Messi but more Argentinian, you know, singing the national anthem. And I think that played well with the wider public, as I'm sure Peter will be able to kind of tell us from his position out there in Argentina. But I don't know. I think he would have been better off, like you said to him, holding off for a while and coming back, giving them the chance to kind of stand on their own 2 feet. But I think the fact that he's come back earlier than we all anticipated is almost like, okay, right, he's back and he's fired up and he doesn't give a flying fuck, but he's going to go out all guns blazing, and be that a sensible decision or not.
Yeah, and I think aside from the CONMEBOL sort of corruption stat thing that you said, it was a much more vocal, in a sense of unified Messi, talking about the future, talking about the positives of the squad, of the youngsters coming through and them beginning to build something new, which he wanted to be a part of. So I'd hope that was him, that will take that side of things rather than him burning any bridges with CONMEBOL and saying, all right, I'm out. Because I also think when you talk about the perception of Messi and him singing the national anthem and being a bit more Argentine in his being a bit more demonstrative, it would be a real shame if he was to walk away now. I think it would play into the hands of those people that have criticised him for so long and say, oh, look, now he's running off when things went badly and he's calling time early. So I think as long as he's got something to give the national team, which he obviously clearly does from a footballing point of view, hopefully he remains and can play a key part. Because I think also it was interesting to see Argentina actually play some of their best games in the tournament when Messi oddly played some of his worst games. And on the one hand, it was worrisome to see Messi have quiet games when we're so used to seeing him do everything. But on the other, quite pleasing to see other people step up. So we'll see what Scaloni can do for the remainder of the year, and then obviously that very difficult World Cup qualifying campaign begins. Just quickly then, before we move on to some of those future options potentially, do Argentina have to worry about the World Cup qualification?
Yeah. In a word, I think that Brazil obviously so much further down the road, as they showed with a very professional performance, and also you can see them evolving into maybe something even more, I don't know, capable of challenging the European sides, with the likes of Artur in midfield and Everton giving them maybe a slightly more anarchic presence on the wings. I mean, I imagine Neymar will probably come back in and take his place, but Brazil are so far down the line compared to where Argentina are that you can't even compare the two. And I feel like both Colombia and Uruguay, despite having disappointing tournaments, are much better stocked in most areas of the pitch. I mean, just look at the options Colombia have at centre back. I think probably their fifth choice centre back would be better than Argentina's best centre back, and they've done well in bringing youth players through, and not leaving that regeneration that the likes of Argentina and Chile have done too late. So I feel like those three sides are all ahead of Argentina, and I'd have them all more likely to qualify. And then it's Argentina could be fighting it out with the likes of Chile, Paraguay, Peru, those sides, even Venezuela, who are up and coming, and have been the hipsters' favourite for a little while now to maybe make their first World Cup. So I think Argentina probably will sneak it, even if it's not automatic direct, even if they go through a playoff. But it's not a sure thing.
Yeah, I think Argentina are on that kind of fourth, fifth cusp, probably in the CONMEBOL table, and what they'll have to hope for is that Chile's goose is completely cooked, particularly as qualifying goes on and those players get older and the lack of anything coming up behind them becomes more and more apparent. And I think Peru were the surprise package in the last qualification, and you know, Peru just finished really, really strongly and came out of nowhere. And I wonder if they can do that again, realistically. I think for Argentina, that they'll kind of just hope that Chile kind of stay in their box again, and that there isn't like a nasty surprise from like an Ecuador or a Peru again, or a Venezuela or someone like that. I mean, I think you're right. I think Brazil will go through no problems. Colombia will qualify with no problems. Uruguay will qualify with no problems. I think you're right. Those three teams are quite a way ahead, even with what they've got coming through. I think Argentina are very much on that's where it's going to be really interesting, and that kind of between 4th to 6th kind of spot. And I very much see Argentina in there, but I do think they'll qualify.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if last time was pretty nervy, I don't expect anything different this time round. So we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, starting in March, in a long, long way before 2022, so a lot can happen in that time. Over the last couple of months as well, we also saw the Under-20 World Cup, so the sort of potentially that conveyor belt of talent that Scaloni could draw upon. Argentina went out in the last 16 on penalties against Mali. Tom, I'll come to you first. What did you make of the Under-20s World Cup campaign? Is there reasons there for further optimism for Scaloni?
Yeah, I mean, probably not for this next cycle. Maybe the one after that. It was never a vintage Argentina crop. It was one that, again, you could take some positive of the fact that the collective was quite good, and the idea of a style of play and a sense of team was stronger than maybe the teams of replete with individual stars that have kind of crashed and burned in recent years. So they were never going to go too far. I think quarters would have been about as far as you could have expected. Ecuador were from the Sudamericano the clear, one South American side that could have made a real dent, and they did very well as expected after a bit of a slow start. But yeah, I think Argentina, they were a bit unlucky to go out because they conceded that equaliser right at the end of extra time and then went out on a penalty shootout. So on another day, they could have quite easily got to the quarters, and that would have represented a decent campaign for them. Ezequiel Barco is one guy who maybe could start to come into the national team picture, because he's he really showed his class, and he was probably the biggest positive after not really featuring too much in the last tournament. And there's some decent players worth monitoring. Roffo is a good keeper. I think Neuen Perez is a really promising centre-back who's already on the books of Atletico Madrid, and he's someone, given the dearth of talent at centre-back for Argentina, in the same way that Foyth has kind of been dropped into the national team setup a bit sooner than you would probably expect. Perez is one that, if he starts getting some regular club football in Europe, could do well, because he seemed like a leader. He seemed like a more of the kind of Walter Samuel style of defending. And then there was Maroni is a nice number 10. Julian Alvarez is a clever and interesting forward who's going to get a lot of game time for River this season. And Adolfo Gaich is I quite like the comparison to kind of a young Harry Kane about him. I don't know, he might stay kind of in that kind of awkward stage, but he's got a similar gait and a similar kind of presence about him. Who knows if he'll go on to have the same career? Probably not, but he's an interesting, different style of forward that Argentina don't produce loads of these days. And then there's a couple of players who I think have real star potential, but we didn't really see a lot from due to sort of lack of game time in Agustin Almendra, who's been monitored by a lot of Italian clubs, Christian Ferreira, the young Cordovan midfielder at River, who's making a big impact there, and the young Pedro de la Vega, the Justin Bieber of Argentinian football, who is a really intelligent young kind of attacking midfielder forward who is still very young, and you wouldn't want to be throwing him into the national team setup just now. But he's one to watch. So I think, as with ever, the conveyor belt of talent in Argentina keeps producing the good players. But I can't see anyone who, maybe apart from Barco, could go into the senior national team setup and kind of be a wild card difference maker just yet.
Yeah, I only saw bits and pieces of the tournament, but I think Neuan Perez, one of the guys you mentioned, he's one that interests me because, I mean, first of all, whenever you're looking at a kind of a youth team and who might break in, you look at basically where the senior team is weak, and yeah, there are quite a few weak spots in Argentina's senior team, but really you're looking at the defence. And Neuan Perez is one that really interests me. I just wonder if, the fact that on one hand, he's at Atletico Madrid, so he's under a fantastic Argentinian coach who's possibly the best defensive coach in the world. So that's quite a good education. But then on the other hand, I kind of look at it and think, well, how much is he going to play for Atleti in the next kind of year or two? Whereas, most of the rest of the squad are still in Argentina and therefore stand a better chance of playing. So it's kind of that balance really, and whether that's quite right. I mean, I think you're right. No one from this under-20 squad is going to immediately parachute into the Argentina squad and save them and definitely qualify them for the World Cup. But I think that's one player I could see, especially looking ahead to 2022, really, he should be in there. He should be in that team by then, you'd have thought. So even if he's not, particularly at the beginning of the qualifiers, someone that's in there, a lot of these guys really have got to be looking at the 2022 World Cup and thinking, well, I'll be approaching my mid-20s by then. But he's one that interests me, based on my admittedly fairly limited knowledge of the Argentina under-20 team.
Yeah, I think actually he's just last week, been sent on loan to one of the newly promoted Portuguese top flight clubs. So hopefully Perez will be seeing some game time this season, because as you say, I think he was one of those players in a position which Argentina are lacking to shine to some extent at the Under-20 World Cup. And I think, Tom, you're right to point out Barco, who struggled since his move to Atlanta in his first season. It showed glimpses of recovering his form from Independiente before the tournament, and certainly took that to Poland as one of, or without question, I thought Argentina's best player. And I think when you look at often how Argentina line up, with Di Maria for years occupying that position on the left, Barco could potentially be a good option if they were to play a 4-3-3 or even a 4-2-3-1, of someone who's quite comfortable playing on that left, drifting inside and linking up play. So he could be one to keep an eye on, depending on how things continue with Atlanta this season. But of course, it's worth pointing out, not just from that squad, some of the players that you mentioned before, Tom, like Vargas, who's just about to seal a move to Espanyol, and Zaracho and Palacios, who I think, were it not for injury, just before the Copa America would have been with Scaloni's squad. So they would have provided something which has been lacking from Argentina's midfield, some of that drive. So even if the under-20s weren't overly impressive, there are a few other young players in and around that could come through to help things out. So not too depressing is the the outlook.
Not to mention Thiago Almada as well, who was a shock exclusion for that squad, and Man City have been linked with him lately for a paltry £10 million. But I think again, he, a bit like Barco when he first broke into the under-20s, when he was still one of the youngest players, he's got star quality written all over him, but he's just a couple of years away in terms of physical development before he can make it. But he's someone who is that talented that he could make a late run, just as the likes of Christian Pavón and Lautaro Martinez kind of did just before the last World Cup. You could see Almada coming from nowhere, and yeah, again, being one of those sort of wide attacking midfielders, which as we've kind of talked about, aren't really nailed down. The likes of Acuña's decent, but I think there's so much room to get, rather than have Di Maria there, you've got all number of kind of Pusetto, Rigoni, Ocampos, Barco, Servi, Piti Martinez, Pavon, all these guys who could kind of, if they hit a bit of hot form, then they could sneak in. So yeah, lots of interest lies ahead, I think, because I don't think any of us really know which way it could turn. It's going to be lively though.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right to point out Almada. I think he should have been in Batista's squad, and we should point out as well, of course, that Batista's named a pretty weak Pan American Games squad. Most teams have denied him access to that, a lot of that under-20 squad. So that won't be a great indication if anyone does tune into the Pan American Games thinking Argentina are a bit ropey, or more ropey than normal. That will be why. But I think Almada will be more key at Vélez this season, with obviously Vargas leaving, and the Superliga season kicks off in a couple of weeks, so that will be worth keeping an eye on some of those players. And lastly, then, obviously, all of the conversation so far about Argentina has been tinged with a bit of doom and gloom, and we've tried to make it as optimistic as possible, but as ever, it's difficult to do so with a lot of the decisions and goings on at the AFA. But there has been one positive over the last month or so, and that was, of course, Argentina's women's team at the World Cup. Tim, what did you make of Argentina at the Women's World Cup?
I thought they were the story of the World Cup, and there were a lot of stories of this World Cup. But kind of, I think one of the things that really jumped out for me at the Women's World Cup, and I've been kind of covering women's football for about 7 years now or so, and some of the kind of stories that come out, because essentially the game's not professional. Only like 3 or 4 countries could properly call themselves professional, and even then it's only like the absolute elite. And some of the stories you hear, and what really came out for me during this World Cup is how a lot of the women themselves, the players themselves, like almost through a labour movement, have pushed a lot of the advances. It hasn't been the media, it hasn't been sponsors, it hasn't been FAs, it's been players themselves kind of fighting for their cause. And I think nobody kind of exemplifies that more than this Argentina team. And what was great was that they played really well, because they were possibly in, they were in one of the hardest groups. Like, I didn't see them getting a point, a goal, anything. I thought they'd be kind of roundly beaten by England and Japan, and then just beaten by Scotland. So for them to come out and, get that point against Japan, and that for me, again, was the moment of that was my moment of the World Cup, just watching those players at full time against Japan and just seeing what it meant to them. And a lot of people who perhaps aren't as literate with women's football maybe don't watch it and automatically relate some of these stories, and some of the stuff that has come out about the Argentina team in the last few years about AFA not paying for hotels for them when they go to away games, so they sleep on the bus. The fact that the team didn't exist for about 2 years, basically they got rid of the manager and didn't bother to replace with another manager, and the team was just completely dormant. And the fact that AFA, the players effectively went on strike over something like, the equivalent of, in English money, £5 expenses a day, which AFA denied them, and then called up a load of scabs from the under-20s. Like, just some like really, really kind of not harrowing, that's probably overstating it, but really like these stories that just make you think, what, like, there are a lot of FAs who just basically haven't paid enough attention to women's football and their women's teams, but with AFA it's like outright disrespect and hostility towards their women's team. And so for them to qualify and then put that performance in was just absolutely incredible. And the goalkeeper, Vanina Correa, Again, one of the stories of the tournament, kind of stopped playing football to look after her children and was convinced to come back, and one of the best players of the group stage, I think, in goal for Argentina. So, I mean, it was a really nice story because it came out of like a bad story, and I hope something that comes out of this is that some of these FAs, AFA very much included, are a bit shamed into doing a bit more for their women's team as these stories come out. I don't know, maybe AFA will just think, oh well, we won't have to deal with it again for another 4 years, but it was hugely positive. And that Scotland game as well, the final game of the group stage, when they're 3-0 down and they're out, and frankly at that point they've taken a point off Japan, which must have been like, that was their whole World Cup, really, taking a point against the former winners and the finalists from last time round. But then to fight back against Scotland from 3-0 down and get it to 3-3 in a game that, in terms of qualifying, wasn't of huge consequence to them, it's just, hugely, hugely positive. And I know, for example, like, my timeline's kind of dominated by Brazilians, and just watching like Brazilian fans, because a lot of the time in women's football there's a sense of solidarity and that rivalry disappears, and the images of Argentina coming back to the airport and getting like a great reception from fans at Buenos Aires, and yeah, for me, I know we're talking just after the tournament now, and we've been through the knockouts, and USA have won it, and you've got Rapinoe and stuff like that. But for me, Argentina were one of, if not the story of the tournament.
Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I think.
Go on.
Go for it, mate. No, you go for it.
No, I was just going to ask you. I mean, you're also in the UK, watching it from there. Interest, obviously, on England being in Argentina's group, and Tim mentioned obviously goalkeeper Vanina Correa and her performance, particularly against England, the penalty save in that game, really shone even further light after that historic point against Japan. Argentina obviously aren't usual sort of positive story in England, but I noticed even in reading the media from here, there seemed to be like just an overall sense of people getting behind this Argentina team.
Yeah, definitely. I think, from everything that Tim's beautifully articulated there about the team, they were very, lovable underdog. Not to patronise them at all there, but from the conditions they've had to fight for, and clearly they're a long way behind some of the more developed women's leagues out there. Their performances, I think, were met with real enthusiasm and a lot of respect for them. I mean, obviously Vanina Correa against England was absolutely huge, and there were calls for her to be in the men's national team. Such her performances, and I thought Barroso and Cometti at centre back were brilliant. They really impressed me, and the likes of, I mean, even people less versed in women's football, may have heard of the likes of Benini and Bonsegundo and Sole Jaimes up front. But they were sort of. I can't claim to be a regular watcher of it, but I was so impressed with the likes of Lorena Benitez as well. I thought she played with so much maturity. I couldn't believe she was only 20 years old. The way that she was really bossing that Argentina midfield, and even like the likes of Dalila Hipólito coming through, show that there's a bright future. And I think all of this, all that hero's welcome they got, deservedly so, is just part of like a wider thing going on in Argentina. Obviously you've got the inauguration of the women, first professional women's league in Argentina coming. It's 2019 is a watershed moment for women's football in Argentina, and it's part of, it's a watershed moment globally for women's football, but the microcosm of Argentina and the women's game there really reflects that. And there's so many sort of other movements going on in Argentina. The Ni Una Menos, the calls for abortion to be legalized, all these kind of feminist movements tie into that, and I think that is something that hopefully is going to continue to give the support and better working conditions for this women's team, because they've been through a lot, and you just see how far they've come from the last World Cup appearance in 2007, when they were getting pumped by Germany 11-0 and England 6-1. Their defensive performances, their work off the ball was absolutely phenomenal, and I think hopefully it's the start of something to come, and maybe the league can start getting there to the levels that we've seen in Colombia, and obviously the Brazilian women's team is much more established as well. So a really positive message, and one that seems to have been sort of taken notice of more than you'd perhaps expect. No, Peter?
Yeah, I think. From my point of view, it seems as though it seemed more driven by the clubs at this stage. I know San Lorenzo were one of the first, if not the first, to give those professional contracts to their women's team some months prior to the World Cup. And there does seem to be, there was sort of a growing movement just before the World Cup, which was no doubt helped by the heroic performances of the team. So one would hope that the AFA then see this and do give them the backing and the financial support that they deserve. Just as we were talking about, time will tell with the senior team. That will obviously be the case with this women's team. But you do feel as though it would be a hugely wasted opportunity for the AFA not to invest in that side of the game after what was such a great tournament for them. Tim, I think more than any women's tournament we've seen before, there seemed so much more focus on this World Cup. Do you see this as being a significant point in the history of the women's game?
Yeah, I do. So, I'm not under the illusion that we're going to start getting like 20, 30,000 crowds for women's domestic games in the UK, or pretty much anywhere, to be honest, on the back of this. But, every time there's a World Cup, there's a little spike in interest, and then, it kind of settles down a bit. But, on the domestic side, you get a little bit more. You build a little bit more of the audience, and there are no easy answers to this, because once again in Europe, once the women's leagues are competing with the men's domestic leagues and Champions League and things like that, that's where the question is. The other challenge it's got is that lots of people in the UK, lots of people in Brazil, 25 million people in Brazil watched the final, and Brazil weren't in it, which is an incredible number, really. And there's stories now of ESPN Brazil like going after the UEFA Women's Champions League rights, going after some rights to some European leagues. But like one of the challenges in the UK, for example, is that even if the television figures remain quite good, that it doesn't become like a TV thing, that the actual attendances go up at games. But I do think it's a bit watershed. And just before the tournament, there were signs of like big brands getting involved. So Barclays is now sponsoring the WSL. My club, Arsenal, MasterCard announced like a commercial partnership with the Arsenal women's team at the end of May. So there's just been a sense for some time that something's happening. And from a commercial point of view, a lot of brands like women's football, because it's seen as, for want of a better phrase, clean and not as toxic as the men's game, and it's like a good opportunity and all of that. And I think maybe some of the political wind has been blowing this way, with the kind of the Me Too movement for a little while. So it's going to be really, really interesting. There are some really big challenges, and it's going to be really interesting. But I think what the real breakthrough is that so many people watched this World Cup, whether they knew anything about the teams or anything else. And I think we just broke a significant barrier in lots of people being willing to watch a game where women are playing, and just watching it and thinking, this is just football, isn't it? It's like some games are good, some games are crap, and some games are brilliant, just like all football. And I think we just got past that thing where people just watch it as a football match and don't wonder all these these oh my god, it's women. Like how I bet it's really different, and what kind of bras do they wear and stuff, and these really base curiosity I think has gone away a little bit, and people kind of take it at face value, and I think that is the significant breakthrough of this World Cup. But it's just it's how things develop from here, how they cultivate the commercial potential, how they get people into the stadiums, and how they deal with competing alongside top level men's football. That's where the challenge is, but I do think it's broken a significant barrier this summer.
Yeah, some of the scheduling was a bit of a disappointment, that they still clashed with the likes of the Copa America and the Gold Cup. So hopefully that was something as well that was brought to the federation's attention. So you'd hope going forward that we won't see any more of a repeat of that as well, to give it its rightful place at the table. But certainly a very positive World Cup, not just for Argentina but for the game in general. So hopefully plenty more where that came from, and I think that will probably do us for this evening, gentlemen, unless you've got anything else you need to add.
Nope.
No. All right. Well, hopefully we will start doing the podcast a little more regularly. That's on me, as I said at the beginning of this one. As ever, huge thank you to you, Tim. That's Stilberto on Twitter, for joining us this evening.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Tom Robinson, at TomRobbo89 on Twitter. Thanks as ever, Tom, for coming on.
Cheers, mate. Always a pleasure. And yeah, thanks as well to Tim there. I echo the sentiments. Really invaluable analysis there of both the Women's World Cup and obviously the Copa America. So yeah, hopefully some more pods to come, right, Peter?
Yeah, well, let's hope so. It's not so well, I mean, I guess for listeners, you always like having a bit of a rant, but it would be nice to be sitting here talking about nothing but positive things. We'll have to wait and see until next time. Well, maybe not next time. Maybe we'll do one a bit sooner. We don't really have any news on the national team, but we'll wait and see. In the meantime, do give both Tim and Tom a follow on Twitter, mostly South American stuff with a splash of Arsenal in Tim's case and a bit of Aston Villa in Tom's. But thank you very much for listening, and hopefully we'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening as ever. Follow or subscribe to keep up to date when the next episode is available, or follow us on Twitter or Facebook. All the details are in the information below. Feel free to leave us a comment or any of the mentioned platforms, whether you have questions or requests, and we will try and get back to you. Thanks again, and we will speak again soon.